Welcome to Plastic Model Mojo, a podcast dedicated to scale modeling, as well as the news and events around the hobby, where we hope to be informative and entertaining and help you keep your modeling mojo alive. Welcome back, listeners. Dave and I are glad you've joined us once again. We hope your modeling mojo is running high and providing you with lots of bench time. We do have a long episode in store for you, so let's dispense with the intro and dive right into episode 30 of Plastic Model Mojo. Well, Dave, is it still raining in Louisville?
It has been raining cats and dogs for 24 straight hours. So, it's perfect day to be inside modeling all day because you don't want to walk outside. How about you?
Just work tonight or today, and haven't got any modeling done yet. We'll talk about what I have gotten done during that segment. What else you been up to model wise besides modeling? Anything?
Well, I've been doing a little bit of reading, obviously, and I think this is the way it is for most modelers. Reading complements your modeling. You know, most of us are history nerds or such, and when you read about a subject, it gets you inspired to work on a subject. Or I've been watching a fair number of YouTube videos on different painting and weathering techniques. So that's been pretty much what I've been doing, non-modeling or modeling related. How about you?
I'm still trying to figure out exactly what we might do different or in addition this year. I think we got a lot of support to not do a whole lot different because people seem to be liking the show, but trying to think of still some extracurricular things through Facebook probably and possibly video. So I'm still just haven't had a lot of time to mess with it yet, but it's still kind of on the back of my mind and trying to figure out how we can up our game a little bit. Other than that, not much.
Well, hopefully we'll get contests this year and we'll be able to up our game that way in addition to whatever else you come up with.
Well, maybe that'll all kind of flow together. So we'll see when we get there. Hopefully not too far off the contest schedule. I don't know. Yep. We'll see.
Keep your fingers crossed. So, Mike, what's your modeling fluid tonight?
Well, I'm hitting the gumball head from Three Floyds. We got some over the weekend. I'm enjoying it. And I'll tell you, man, this stuff's just sublime. It's a really good beer. If I make Vegas, I'm going to have to check a bag.
Definitely. I plan on hauling some out so we can share it around with some of the listeners and some of the other podcast hosts.
Because Three Floyds distribution is not very broad still. So I'm sure they do not have this in Las Vegas.
I suspect you're right.
Well, what are you drinking?
Well, Mike, I am drinking a little brew from Evil Twin Brewing Company called Molotov Cocktail.
Oh, my.
It is an Imperial India Pale Ale with mango and orange. So this is my first try at it. Hang on, I'll tell you. Whoa, that is strong.
It should be.
Yeah, it's about 12% alcohol by volume. It's pretty much the equivalent of a strong wine. And you can taste the orange, you can taste the mango, but the India Pale Ale hoppiness, it kind of reaches out and smacks you in the face. So we'll see how this one goes through the episode. This is a new experience. I'm trying something new, and I'll let you know as the episode goes on how it works. By the way, Mike, I know you know this. Do you know in what war the term Molotov cocktail was coined?
Well, I do not. Maybe the Bolshevik Revolution.
Nope. The Russo-Finnish War. 3940, named after the Russian foreign minister Vladislav Molotov. of the famed Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact later on.
And my guess was because I thought maybe a lot of those guys were old guard from the revolution. So, well, they all were until after Khrushchev or Brezhnev, actually. Yeah.
But yeah, it was actually coined by the Finns, who were improvising anti-tank weapons. And that's where the Molotov cocktail came from.
Well, there you go. I've always said that you were the best trivia partner in the world.
Yeah, you know what? We've got to all get together, you, me, Robin, and Ruthie, and do one of those pub trivia things. I think we'd be pretty good at it.
Well, that's a good idea. I'll have to throw that by her and see what she thinks. She likes to do it, so maybe. We'll see.
Oh, Ruthie loves it. She's hyper competitive.
Classic Model Mojo date night. Well, I tell you, there's the mailbag just will not stay empty.
That's good.
It is. So I'm going to dive into it here, and I've done a little triage, so hopefully we can get through these. First up is Frank Whitner from Casa Grande, Arizona. And he started modeling aircraft with his dad in what he calls the 1 true scale, 48 scale, and he apologizes to you for that. Does that hurt?
That hurt.
He said our critical mess comment really hit home. So it makes me wonder what his bench looked like when he started writing this email. It says he wasn't feeling his hobby boss FM2, so he boxed it up, cleaned up the bench, and broke out some armor kits. And he's kind of an armor guy as well. Now, one thing he tells us is that CAMs, which is combat armor models, which is kind of a offshoot of Rish or Reich models. It's one of the Hong Kong or Taiwan Chinese companies there. They actually have another Polish tank. You were looking for a Polish subject in one of the last episodes, and they actually box a Polish version of the Vickers 6-ton light tank.
Oh, really?
That's right.
Really? I'd love to do that.
Check that one out. It's got the crazy 3-tone black outline camo on it, typically.
Yeah.
Kind of a precursor to the 7TP.
I'll have to take a look at that. Thank you for that tip.
I've looked at them because I keep thinking maybe they'll do a 7TP as well. So I don't know. Somebody will do one of these days. Moving on, we've got Mystery Rider, initials JC. I should have followed up and got a name, but he's got no name, no geo, just his initials, JC. And sent us a rather lengthy email, but he hit on one point that I'll share with the listeners because it's a good idea. He shares an idea around the theme of paint mules. And he says he can't bear the thought of using something off his shelf of shame or shelf of doom because he has full intent on finishing those. So he doesn't want to muck them up, as an airbrush or weathering paint mule. So he buys up cheap model railroad rolling stock at yard sales and uses those because they have lots of rivets and panel lines to experiment with. And he can practice on those all day long. And when he decides he doesn't like it, he just throws it in the stripper and starts over.
That's a good idea. A corollary to that is when you go to model contests in the vendor room, there's always somebody who's got kits from 40 years ago that Lord knows have been superseded that they're trying to blow out for just a few bucks. Buy one or two of those, clip out the main parts, the wing, the body, whatever, and just use that as your paint mule.
And if and that makes me think if you'd rather have a completed model, quite often at some of these shows, somebody's selling a bunch of old built-ups, that typically aren't very good, and that'd be another way to do it.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right.
Next up is Ken Beckler, and he hails from the Jack Weislich Polish Coast Watchers Modeling Club out of Peoria, Illinois. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that? Is that a thing?
The Polish Coast Watchers is a long established IPMS club, and given the fact that they are in the middle of Illinois, Polish Coast Watchers is the joke.
Okay. He gave a kit hold that needs to be filled, and that would be. He says the hobby needs a Tupolev Tu-114 airliner and 1 to 1/44 scale.
He's right about that. That's the civilian version of the Tu-95. Is it the Tu-95 or the Tu-16? I think Tu-16. It's the civilian airliner version of the Russian bomber. And they were, that was the airliner in the 50s and 60s behind the Iron Curtain.
So that's an interesting suggestion. I don't know. I don't know much about that scale, so I can't say whether that's going to come to fruition or not. You never know.
Yeah.
Does anybody make the bomber version in that scale?
In that scale, I do not know. I'm not 100% sure, although I do believe that A model may have done that aircraft in 72nd scale, the airliner version.
And he may have mentioned that, actually.
Yeah, I may have to go back and check my resources, but I think that they may have. But yeah, it is a whole, especially since 1/44 is airliner scale, and that is a real hole because it was used by all of those Iron Curtain airlines.
He does say that there's an A model 72nd scale kit out there for a small fortune, and it's crude. He says.
I've seen one built up. One of our club members built one up once.
He also hopes to see us at the Roscoe Turner show, either the one they're trying to have in the when is it?
April.
Yeah, we'll see about that. I don't know.
I'm going, man. Heck or high water. If they hold it, I'll be there.
Up next is Eugene. I don't know if it's Sueda or Suda. I apologize, Eugene. He's looking for U.S. Navy searchlights in 1 to 350th scale. Eugene, I would recommend you look into Model Monkey out of North Carolina. They make a lot of 3D printed Navy-themed models. I'm not sure he's got individual U.S. searchlights, but if he does not, I would ask, as he might be able to break that out into a separate print for you, and he might sell you some. I don't know. And he also states that he recently joined the IPMS as well. So,
all right. Absolutely.
So yeah, check out Model Monkey. I tell you, I bet Shapeways has them, but I'm not going to tell you to go there.
Yeah, I know.
They're behind the times.
Yep, absolutely.
Robert Perlman from, I think, the western coast of Canada. He's written in before. He says he's loving Jefferson's very small batch bourbon, and he's asking us a bourbon question, Dave.
Uh-oh.
He wants to know if Jefferson's ocean aged is a gimmick or if it's actually something to that.
Yes and yes. I haven't had it yet, but I know people who have. And the answer, I think, to both questions is yes. It is a gimmick, but it does impart a different taste.
I would imagine you have to be a pretty good connoisseur of bourbon to appreciate that.
Probably so.
Yeah, I know they're bombing Facebook with the advertisement.
Oh, are they really?
Well, maybe I've got mine tuned to get bourbon ads. I don't know.
Geez, Mike, what might that say?
I don't know. Anyway, he sends some of his top threes from our four-way list there from a while back. And I never did put that on Facebook after the last episode. Gosh, shame on me. I need to do that. In his preferred scale and genre, he's got the Border Models Leopard, among IDF Magok, and a Mini Art T-55. And so he's an armor guy, obviously.
Those are all good.
Yeah. Outside of his preferred scale and genre, he's got Arma Hobby's FM2 Wildcat.
Yes.
At least one machining Krieger kit. That could be fun.
Yeah.
And you'll like this one, a 72nd scale Hasegawa Sukhoi 35.
Good choice.
That's a warm-up for the 48 scale version. Which is what he says.
The 48 scale version of that model is freaking huge. I mean, it's a big airplane.
Oh, yeah. Big plane.
In 48 scale, that thing's going to be he better clear off some table space. That's all I got to say.
Oh, next up is Brian Hughes out of Boston, Massachusetts. And he's got some Polish connections in his, I think his wife is Polish. So he says the beer you drank last episode is pronounced Okochim.
Yes, he's not the only one to correct my pronunciation. Our local Polish club member, Tom Balki-Romanowski, immediately on us dropping that episode, shot me a message to tell me that I had mispronounced the name of the beer.
He said it was a good episode, though. He lobbed you a softball first.
Good.
Tim Cavalier, pretty regular contributor, and this is a good one. I'm going to let you take this one. Please explain unicorn tears. Now he knows that it's Mr.
Color leveling, right?
From the Gunzi range. How is that different than other thinners, and why is it so desirable? Ready, set, go.
Okay, that's a great question, and there are a lot of different opinions. I'm not sure that anyone knows for sure what the secret magic is, which is, I think, one of the things that lends itself to the name unicorn tears. But my understanding is that it is a lacquer thinner with a retarder and some other secret stuff in it that makes it perform better than just straight lacquer thinner. And it certainly does, because I've got Mr. Color lacquer thinner, the straight Mr. Color thinner, and it is not the same stuff as unicorn tears. I don't know that anyone knows. We probably ought to give a sample to your wife, the chemical engineer, and let her try and reverse engineer it and figure out what it is. But it certainly performs differently and better than any other lacquer thinner, better than Tamiya lacquer thinner, better than the regular Mr. Color lacquer thinner, or Home Depot lacquer thinner. It makes the paint perform better. It sprays better. It smooths out better. It dries better. I wish I was educated enough to tell you for sure exactly what the deal is, but it's magic. It's unicorn tears.
It's the secret sauce, man. It's like barbecue.
Exactly.
Good barbecue.
Good barbecue.
Well, I'm going to have to get some because I want to practice with it, and if I have success, I'm going to use it on the E16. But we'll talk about that later.
All right.
He also mentions, now this is kind of old hat now because the other podcasts have covered it, but we can have our take on it. The closing of Squadron Mail Order. Like I said, the other podcasts have covered it, so it's not hot news. I would say that they've been in a slow and steady decay since they purchased VLS Corporation.
Yep. I think that the individual who bought Squadron and then went out and started buying other hobby-related companies, he had an interesting idea to build an empire, but like many companies found out over the years, leverage is a two-edged sword. And
I'm sure
if you over leverage, especially to the venture capitalists, they're like vultures hovering around waiting for you to stumble. And he apparently did. And when he did, they swooped in and picked the carcass clean and have spent the last few years just stripping everything of value out of Squadron. And then what was left was a husk. And they did a blowout sale and were right into bankruptcy.
Which is, it's kind of sad. I haven't done business with them in a long time just because it seemed like they never had what I was looking for.
Right.
But, I remember, gosh, probably 40 years ago now, 30 years ago, where you would get on their mailing list and you get those flyers in the mail like once a month or every other week or something like that.
It's once a month.
And then once a year you got their full-blown catalog. And I bought so much of my early modeling subject matter from them, books, kits, paints. It's kind of sad they're gone, but I guess that's what happens. There's so many mail order places now that if you're not on the top of your game and leveraged on top of that, then you're not going to succeed.
For nostalgia purposes, it kind of makes you feel bad just for not necessarily for that we're losing something, because I think by the time it ended, we really weren't. But there are a lot of good memories over the years about them.
Up next is Neil Tully. He's an Australian expat living in Kobe, Japan. And that might be fun if you like steak.
Oh, yeah.
Now, he recommends we try some Japanese whiskey. And I'm curious because he recommends a couple of Suntory labels. And he says anything from Yamazaki, which I've not heard of. Suntory is a huge company. I've certainly heard of them, but the other one I have not.
Suntory ended up buying Jim Beam, didn't they?
Yeah, I think they own Jim Beam over here. So
Yes,
bourbon's popular in Japan. So
it is.
they're doing their own now. He says it's similar to bourbon. It's more like bourbon than Scotch or something. But that's what he recommends. But back to modeling, he mostly models 72nd scale aircraft.
Yay!
His goal for 2021, kind of on our theme of what's your plan for getting better, or our top 3 or 4 categories we've been messing around with. His goal for 2021 is to slow down and just improve his general construction, which it's a very good idea.
Yep. And ironically, by slowing down, you'll speed up, because if you slow down, you make fewer mistakes, and fewer mistakes leads to actually faster building. I think that is one of our listeners quoted the old Navy SEAL mantra: "Slow is smooth, and smooth is fast."
He's got a couple interesting questions.
All right.
Any tips? Well, let me back up. He likes building aircraft with kind of the complex, I don't know, kind of like Tiger Meat, maybe, those kind of schemes.
Yeah.
Air show schemes, maybe. I don't know, acrobatic schemes. There's complex schemes, not the more traditional combat schemes. But anyway, he's got one question is, any tips on rescribing the circumferential panel lines on the tapered tips of external fuel tanks?
God, I wish. Rescribing is one of my goals for this year, as I think I mentioned in a previous episode. I need to get better at it.
So, Neil, you're asking the wrong guys.
Yeah, that's true. But I will say, as far as that goes, the set of scribers from UMM, if the ones with the fairly long straight blade, will allow you to go around the circumference of a fuel tank. That, combined with the Tamiya flexible white tape, where you can lay that down, and because it's flexible, you can actually make a circle that will stay a circle on a cone shape. If you use those two things in common, I think it may actually work out for him. But that is one area where I'm trying to get better.
Now, I've never done this before, but one thing that came to my mind when you asked this question was to, if you have a pair of calipers, measure the diameter at the panel line, and then make a jig of some sort by drilling a hole as close to that size as you can get. Because if you could build a jig where you had a stationary blade and you just drop this thing in a hole and give it a turn, that could be really easy. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and a variation on that is, if you get a set of drafters, a drafter's template with all the different circle sizes, if you find the size that fits that, you can drop it down over, and then now it's going to take some work, but you can drop that over the nose cone of the fuel tank and get yourself a reference line for your subsequent engraving.
So it's an interesting problem, which makes me want to try it.
That's the engineer in you, Mike.
That's right. So his other question is similar. With these complex schemes, a lot of times those carry over down to the external fuel tanks. And he's wanting to know any advice on getting these complex decals around these tapered ends of the fuel tanks. And I tell you, that's a tough one. That's kind of the A game for decal application, putting the complex decals over tight curves.
Yeah, it really is. If you get a really good set of decals, hopefully the manufacturer has taken into account the three-dimensional nature of the fuel tank, and so designed their decals so that it's, like the old Mercator projections of maps,
yes.
where they slice it up so that
it looks like an orange peel.
Like an orange peel. So if the decal manufacturer is good on their A game, they'll manufacture the decal in such a way as they do that. If they don't, then it's up to you. And I wish I had good tips for exactly how you do that, but that's tough. It's one of the things that keeps me away from those memorials and anniversary schemes.
All right, we got one more. This is from Dennis Tennant out of Wisconsin. He got excited during our appearance on the Bench 101, our special chat with those guys for their 100th episode celebration. He got excited when you mentioned a segment on geezer skills, thinking it was a reference to old school skills from veteran modelers, but then he replayed the episode, and to his disappointment, you actually said tweezer skills.
You know, Dennis, by the way, is a really funny guy, and that's pretty much that sticks with his sense of humor. Do you know an episode on geezer skills may actually come in handy? We'll have to put that one back and think about it, because
I'm going to flesh that one out a little bit.
Yeah, really, I like that.
All right, well, that wraps up our listener mail, Dave.
Well, that's a good batch of listener mail, Mike. If the listeners are done listening to the listener mail and want to do us a favor, they can, at the end of this episode, when you're done listening, if you'll take a minute to rate us on whatever podcast listening app you're using, give us 5 stars, leave a review. We would appreciate it. It helps drive up the visibility. Our podcast continues to gain listeners pretty much every episode. And so I appreciate all you're doing out there for us. If you would rate the episode and tell a friend. If you've got somebody in your modeling club, somebody you're close to who's a modeler who's not listening, turn them on to listening to podcasts, and particularly this podcast. We'd appreciate it.
And while you're doing that, have a listen to all our other podcast friends out there. And before I start running down the list, I just want to say we had an interesting conversation via Facebook Messenger this week. We're all cooperating and trying to get our drop dates scheduled to keep everybody bringing you great content on different days. So all the other podcasts out there, we appreciate it. And hopefully it's gonna work out good for everybody, the podcast and listeners alike. On the Bench out of Australia is up to episode 103, which is their 3rd installment from their 100th episode celebration. They've got Stuart and Anthony from Scale Model Podcast. Plastic Posse Podcast out of the United States is up to episode 12, and they have their first roundtable type discussion on armor with some personalities in the armor modeling world out there. Scale Model Podcast out of Canada, episode 63, and Anthony is interviewing Stephen Bass of Stevens International. Just Making Conversation out of the UK, Malcolm and James discuss the ups and downs of social media in scale modeling as it relates to scale modeling. It's an interesting conversation. And the Model Geeks here another one here in the USA. They just kicked off their inaugural episode recently, and they've dropped their second. So welcome aboard, guys. We look forward to hearing what you bring.
Yep.
In addition to the podcast, we got some blogs and YouTube friends out there. Please take in a Model Airplane Maker from Chris Wallace, a Scale Canadian TV from Jim Bates on YouTube, Sprue Pie with Frets from our friend Stephen Lee, and I also want to plug Inch Eye Guy's blog, Mr. Jeff Groves out of Indiana, and see what he's got going on in 72nd scale.
He's got a great blog. And when you're done with all that, if you're not a member of IPMS USA or your own national IPMS chapter, please consider joining IPMS USA, IPMS Canada, IPMS Australia, whatever country you happen to live in. Join your national organization. It really helps. They're a great group of people trying to do a lot for the hobby. A lot of the structure that we have as far as local clubs and local contests is only because of the existence of the national chapters. So please go ahead, join. I'd consider it a personal favor. Thank you.
Countdown to Vegas, Dave.
All right. Cannot wait. Cannot wait.
At the time of this recording, we are 205 days away from the IPMS National Convention in glittery Las Vegas, Nevada.
That's going to be fantastic.
Well, I got an email from Bob Lomasaro, and he says they're now sold out of vendor tables.
Yay. That's a great sign.
With a caveat, it is a great sign, but they've had to eliminate a few tables to meet social distancing guidelines. So it sounds like the authorities in Las Vegas are still planning on COVID potentially being a problem by the time this rolls around. So I hope that's not the case.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully we're in better shape by then. Trophy sponsorships. Trophy sponsors continue to roll in, but there's still plenty to choose from. So he wants us to plug that. So if your club or an individual or a business would like to sponsor a trophy package for the IPMS National Convention, please jump on their website, the convention website, and poke around there, and you'll be able to find out where you can do that and find out what's left for you to be able to sponsor. And I'm sure they'd appreciate it.
Well, Mike, didn't we sponsor a trophy package?
Yes, we did.
We did. Well, you know what? We ought to challenge the other podcasts to step up and sponsor a trophy package for the national.
There you go, guys. Dave just threw down the glove.
There you go.
Well, we'll see what happens after that. We may have lost a bunch of friends, but anyway. Room night sales now total 2,900, which is 1,300 over their budgeted total.
That's great.
So people are sure booking hotel rooms. Interest and excitement continues to build. Their two government tours, Nellis Air Force Base and the Atomic Test Site, are on hold for now due to COVID restrictions. If they open up again, they will be limited to 50 people per tour, sold on a first-come, first-served basis. But Bob says this is Vegas after all. So there's still plenty to see and do in everyone's spare time should these tours not happen.
Well, fingers crossed, because the Nellis tour would be well worth the money. Let me tell you, it's well worth doing if they can pull it off. And we understand that, you know, when you're dealing with the U.S. government, you know, it's a crapshoot at best.
And might not make any sense at all.
Yes, government not make sense? Who heard of such a thing? In any event, I wish them luck. I hope that comes off. And if it does, you all definitely want to take those tours. They'll be well worth it.
All right. Well, that's the Vegas update.
Mike, have you been modeling lately? What's your bench look like?
It's been a little slow, Dave, but I tell you, I'm getting some stuff done. The ZIS-2 anti-tank gun, I've been blending what I consider some bad color choices on my my highlights on that kit, that build, and I finally got a good tube of Optoling 502 olive green oil paint, and I've been kind of using that to blend and using it as a glaze or filter to kind of correct some of those color issues I had, and it's really shifting it back to something I find really favorable. I may have to go back with the pen wash after I get the green done, and I still consider this base coat work. I've not really started what I consider the weathering yet. I'm trying to distress the green and blend these kind of off shades I chose for the highlights to get it kind of not get it one color green, but kind of one of the colors was a little too brown, and I really didn't like it. So the using the oil paints over top of it in a thin layer is kind of correcting that back to the base color. That's going pretty well. I've got about a third of one of the split trail arms left to do, and then I can start on the other weathering. But that was the plan until I found a seam line yesterday that's going to maybe require a bit of negative modeling here over the weekend.
Oh no!
Yeah, I know. The wash I put on it brought out a seam line on the inside face of one of the split trails. Now, remember, one of my gripes about this kit was everything around in this kit's molded in two halves.
Yeah,
pretty much. So I missed something, and I don't know if it'll show or not once it's on the base, because it's kind of on the underside or right at the the radius turns back to the bottom.
Yeah.
But you know what? It's going to kill me if I don't try. It won't be a bad touch up, but we'll see.
Yeah.
So negative modeling's never good, but beats having a seam line on a build you're kind of excited about.
Yeah.
My E16 Paul, not much to report from what I gave last week, but our last episode. But I have primer in hand now, so I'm hoping over the weekend here or later this week I can get a primer coat on it. I see I need to still rescribe the panel line wraparound, like the ones that wrap around the leading edge of the wing.
Yeah, that's one that people commonly miss.
Yeah, they kind of fade away after all the sanding there, so I need to take care of that before I prime it. And I can't find this Dymo label tape anywhere.
I've got like 4 packs. I'll mail you one tomorrow.
Okay. Well, I was hoping to not have you do that, but I do appreciate it.
Not a problem.
Well, my build itch needs a scratch, Dave, and I don't know. That BM13N Katusha is starting to look pretty good. Panzerwerfer 42 on the Maltier tractor is looking pretty good too. And that one's kind of interesting because when we threw that one out there with our episode on our list of threes,
Yeah.
John Bonani actually sent me a message and echoed his desire to build that old Artillery kit as well. So like me, he's got all the aftermarket. He was wanting somebody to 3D print the launcher, so that would go a little bit easier. But yeah, that's the big beef with that kit. But I don't know. It's gonna be one of those two. I'm feeling it's gonna be a rocket launcher of some sort.
Yeah, with 2 in the paint booth, it looks like you need to have something in the construction area.
Yeah, I think so. Well, what about your bench, Dave? What are you doing?
Well, ironically, you and I are, as far as your Zis 2 and my M30, we are in similar places. In this past last 2 weeks, I took the M30 and I started applying color modulation with my hard-earned Steenbeck Infinity and using the AK Real colors and unicorn tiers and using that to apply color modulation on the M30. And this, keep in mind, I've never done this before on a piece of armor. I don't know anything what I'm doing, so I'm trying to watch YouTube videos and learn. The hard-earned Steenbeck allowed me to place paint exactly where I wanted it, allowed me to apply the color modulations in the exact spots I was looking for. And I finished the color modulation and then I sealed it with the coat of future so that I could begin highlighting and pin washing. Now, again, I'm feeling my way blind on this. I've never done any of this before. This is all brand new to me. And so, I'm kind of guessing what's next and what to do in what order. And when I'm confused, I text Mike and ask him, hey, Mike, should I do it this way or in this order? And we'll see what comes out. But so far, I'm really liking it. The Mossy, the Mosquito is moving ahead. We had another Zoom call of the Mosquito group the other night. And while I'm making progress, I'm behind the other guys, so I need to step it up. And the TU-128 is sitting there. I've worked on the main fuselage area, and it's about ready for rescribing. And I'll be honest with you, there's a little intimidation factor because this thing's going to be bare metal. The rescribe has to be perfect because any flaw is going to show. And so I'm a coward.
You're staring at it.
Yes,
at it.
Exactly. I'm a coward. I'm staring at it and letting it intimidate me.
Like a car accident.
Exactly. What's your plan for getting better? The whole point of what your plan for getting better is actually doing stuff and not being afraid that it won't work out 100%. So I'm going to suck it up, cowboy up, and start the rescribing process.
Well, in addition to your builds, Dave, what broke your wallet in the last couple of weeks, a month?
Actually, I've been, I hate to admit this, I've been pretty good as far as that goes. I bought a couple of bottles of Alclad because I'm going to need them for the TU-128 build. And I ordered off of eBay the Famous Aircraft of the World book on the TU-128. And other than that, I have restrained myself beautifully. I have not bought any new kits, although there are a bunch of them I want. I haven't made any big purchases. So I've been actually pretty good as far as not breaking my wallet too bad. Maybe I just dented it. So what broke your wallet?
Well, Christmas kind of padded my wallet. I made a reference to that eBay gift card I got for Christmas, and I put a hurting on it.
Uh-oh. What did we do?
Well, in anticipation for this Katusha build, I bought a set of Royal Models rockets because they're cast as one piece.
Right.
I was haunted by the old Italeri Katusha rockets that are two halves and two fins, four fins, whatever. And was thinking that was going to not be fun. And then I bought that Trumpeter post-war truck with the same launcher on it. And I really didn't pay attention to the rockets that were in that kit. And so I got these resin cast rockets, and I was like, well, let's see how these are going to work with this Trumpeter launcher. And I had stuff out dry fitting and mucking around last weekend. And the Trumpeter rockets bodies are cast as one piece. They're not cast in left and right halves.
Really?
So they're actually nicer than the Royal Models resin rockets I just bought.
That happens.
But there's only enough to stock the rails of the launcher. So somewhere in my German eBay photo archive, I've got a German snapshot of a Katyusha rocket in the shipping crate. And I need to find that photograph because that's probably what I'm going to do with some of the resin rockets. I think that would be nice.
So then you can use that as an excuse to 3D print a whole bunch of packing crates.
I guess I could do that. And I got a fresh can of spray primer for the E16 Paul. To me, I said it last episode. It was getting a little low, and I'm scared to use it on the aircraft at this point. I don't want to muck it up. I got a new tube of Optiling 501 oil paint, which I mentioned already. But that's all popcorn, right?
Yep.
My big hitter is I finally bought Neil Stokes' book, KV Technical History and Variants from Air Protection.
Great book.
So,
see,
yeah.
I've got a soft spot for the KV. I mean, I know everybody loves the T-34, but the KV to me is just, it's Russian. It's industrial. It's hulking.
The quintessential tank.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess I have a soft spot for expensive books. So,
speaking of that, Mike, when you decide to dive into a KV, I've got a complete set of model cast and tracks already done and ready to go for you.
I think we've had this conversation before.
We did.
So I got about $22 left on my gift card. So we'll see.
Buy something for the wife.
I probably should.
Yes.
Well, our special segment tonight is entitled Dr. Strangebrush. And we're going to have a little conversation with Mr. John Miller of Model Paint Solutions. And he's hopefully going to share with us some airbrushing tips that folks can use to do a little bit better job with their airbrushing. So how about we just get right into that, Dave?
Sounds great.
Well, tonight I would like to welcome John Miller to Plastic Model Mojo. John, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
John is the owner of Model Paint Solutions, and I believe you're also an often airbrush clinician. Is that correct?
I am. Through the site, I pretty much repair anything and everything that shoots paint. If it's a Grex, or if it's a Badger, or if it's a Hardra Steenbeck, or if it's an Iwata, I either have owned it or I have worked on it. So, yeah. And
you also run a website and a web business, Model Paint Solutions. What can you tell us real quick about that before we get into our more meaty topics here?
Okay. In 10 seconds, I'm a retired research biochemist, and I was teaching airbrushing classes out of my favorite hobby shop here in Seattle, Skyway Hobbies. And the response I got was pretty astounding. We had more and more guys showing up every other Saturday, and I got a big kick out of actually teaching something that I enjoy, and I'm passionate about. And one thing led to another, and before I knew it, Model Paint Solutions was started, and the focus is airbrushing, and in particular, the tools and the techniques that will help the average builder get started diluting paints and primers appropriately so that they get good results and they don't have to go through that trial and error that so many people do. And then lastly, real quick, I also want to thank my web developer, Daniel, because without that guy, I would not have Model Paint Solutions. He is like my ace up the sleeve.
Well, I recommend the website often, and you've helped me in the past with some issues I was having with a particular line of paint. And there's so many resources on your website. It's just it's a go-to. it's a must visit for anybody trying to get better with airbrushing. So your web developer's done a good job putting it all together, and certainly the content on that website is invaluable to someone really trying to learn how to use their airbrush to the best they can.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
John, you've done presentations at how many IPMS nationals now?
We've done two. The last was Chattanooga, as I recall, and again had a real good response both times. And again, the approach that I try to push when teaching classes and on the site is, you're never going to read one of my articles and read that I suggest you dilute it to the consistency of milk. I won't even get started with the ambiguities there. So I try to take all of the guesswork out. It may require some guys to step outside of the box that they're comfortable with, that they haven't ever used, a milliliter system. But once you see it explained, and that is just basically factors of 10, it is so intuitive and easy that most guys do not have a problem with it. And lastly, all of the stuff on the site is basically lab grade measuring tools that I used for 25 years at the research bench that somehow managed to jump into my briefcase on the way home every day from lab and ended up on my workbench. And those same science tools are on the site. And, since they're science grade, you can use them with lacquers, enamels, or acrylics. You can measure anything you want.
Well, getting on into our topics for the night, you forwarded us one of your articles, and I think it was the 4 most common airbrush problems.
Yes.
And what do you want to do? You want to just work through this list and let you talk about some of these things?
Well, I think, if you guys are willing to take on, this a rather mature subject, we can discuss tip dry. And it's an airbrushing malady that affects most guys sooner or later. And a lot of guys are hesitant to talk about it. A lot of guys don't want to talk about their tip dry, but we can start there.
Let's talk about tip dry.
Well, bless your heart, Dave. So tip dry, defined as the buildup of dry paint around the nozzle needle interface there with almost any brush. Tip dry is what causes the goobers to build up that will, of course, fling themselves off your airbrush right into the middle of that perfectly clean panel on your Focke-Wulf 190 that you're painting. Tip dry is also the cause of why you get intermittent spraying, why you get clogging, why you get spattering while you're trying to shoot a straight and fine line. And the cause of tip dry almost all the time is caused by paint that is insufficiently dilute. That is to say, paint that's being shot too thick. And in my experience through Model Paint Solutions, most of the emails and the calls I get are from guys that have, issues with tip dry, issues with their spraying, which can almost always be tracked back to not diluting their paint sufficiently.
Do you, John, do you find that tip dry occurs more in acrylics than in either enamels or lacquers?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So tip dry is going to be worse with acrylic paints. I've often said in my classes and in articles as well, the easiest, the finest paint to use for fine line, super fine line work is an enamel, because it dries so slowly. You don't get the kind of tip dry issues that you get with lacquers or especially with acrylics. So one of the easiest ways to deal with tip dry is to take a look at the concentration of paint that you're shooting. And irrespective whether you're counting drops or you're doing it by a percent volume or you're doing it by eye, if you can guesstimate that you are shooting roughly 50% paint and 50% thinner, that's too thick, okay? Even with the Vallejo Model Air, which I know they say comes ready to shoot out of the bottle, and yes, it can be shot right out of the bottle. The question is, will that give you the finest finish right out of the bottle? Usually not. Usually even Vallejo Model Air, I will add maybe 20 to 30% thinner to Vallejo Model Air to thin it down a little bit to make that finish a little finer. And in addition to that, in addition to just increasing the dilution of the paint to something below 50%, you also want to think about, if you're shooting acrylics, including something like Liquitex Flow Aid. And you can get Liquitex Flow Aid. It has a black label. It says Flow Aid on it. And at any Joann's, Fabrics, or Michael's, or many craft stores across the country carry Liquitex products. I've been using Liquitex for 20 years, and I have it in all of my acrylic thinners in order to deal with tip dry, because it decreases it greatly. So you want to think about adding some Liquitex, and I can tell you by percent volume, I usually add Liquitex to anywhere between 5 to 10% by volume to my thinner. And then once that is in the thinner, I'll make up a large bulk solution of that Liquitex thinner, whether it's Vallejo or Life Color or whatever. This is for acrylics now. And then I'll use that 10% Liquitex thinner solution for diluting all of my paints. It's easier to have the Liquitex in there already than to have to add a drop or two of Liquitex to your paint cup every time you mix your paint.
Now, John, that brings up an obvious question or an obvious reaction that I think some people will have. If you dilute your paint beyond 50 or 60%, whatever, how do you deal with the opacity issue? That obviously thinner paint is less opaque.
Well, you can take the thinnest paint you want, and you can shoot a completely, how would I say it, confluent, completely filled in finish, maximal opacity, if you will. Even with the thinnest paint, you simply apply it more with more coats. So a thought on that, guys who like to shoot 50, 60% paint because they like to say, well, I get the whole thing painted in one pass. Okay, that's true. But think about this just for 1 second. If you're dealing with a model that has really fine inscribing on it, like, some of the Bondi kits, that are amazing. I don't do sci-fi kits regularly, but the Bondi stuff is amazing when it comes to inscribing. Ditto that for DML, Dragon, Edouard. Some of the 48 stuff is just unreal. The inscribing is so fine that if you're using a real thick layer of paint, you're going to be filling a lot of that inscribing in. And that's where you're going to have a problem later on in the finishing process if you're trying to do washes to light up all those panel lines, and somehow, for some reason, your wash won't flow through those inscribed lines. It could be because you have too thick a layer of paint on there and you filled those lines in. So that's one thing to think about. In addition to just the brush behaving better because you're shooting a thinner paint as well, there's less headaches. You have to wipe the tip off less frequently because you have less tip dry. The other thing to think about is if you're interested in doing pre-shading. So real quick, an example would be you have a P40 Warhawk, you have primed it white, and you want to shoot the panel lines black. Okay, so you shoot the panel lines black, you do your fine line work, and now you're going to shoot the OD green on top of it. Do you want to go with a thick paint? Because if you go with a thick paint and you do just one pass too many, you lose all your pre-shading. So the idea, especially if you're shooting over something pre-shading, the idea would be use a slightly, even a thinner dilution than you normally do, with the idea that, it's going to take 4 or 5 passes to get the coverage that I want, but that gives me finer control over that coverage. So I can make maybe one more pass and get more green, but I can still see that black pre-shading coming through the color. And with the thicker paint, that one last pass might just completely cover the pre-shading and the work that you've done. So there's 3 quick reasons for thinking about maybe shooting with a thinner paint.
Now, you mentioned something there that I want to illuminate. You talked about wiping the tip, and now I've seen your demonstration, so I know what you're talking about. But the people who haven't seen it before may not understand what you're talking about with wiping the tip of your airbrush.
Sure. So again, you don't have to do it as much with enamels or lacquers, but if you're shooting acrylics, one of the things you're going to want to have right next to your shooting hand is a little container of your thinner and a micro brush or a small paintbrush soaking in that. And every, I would say, 2 to 3 minutes of spraying time, I stop and I take that micro brush soaked with thinner, and I very carefully clean the base of the needle where it protrudes right out of the nozzle orifice. And I try to keep that paintbrush or micro brush oriented 90 degrees to the needle, never head on to the needle, but actually 90 degrees to it. And many airbrushes have air caps with protective, assemblies on the tip that protect the needle nozzle, but still allow you to get a micro brush through the side of the air cap so you can get at the nozzle needle interface. So yes, anytime I'm shooting acrylics, I will have a rig like that set up next to me, and I'll be cleaning the tip every couple of minutes. One thing on that, if you're doing mottling, or if you're doing, let's say, Italian smoke circles or something like that, where you're doing fine line airbrushing, where you're going to have even more tip dry because you have more paint, or excuse me, you have less paint and more air when you're shooting a fine line, the ratio of the two. So you have even more tip dry when you're doing fine line. So when you're doing some fine line, let's say you're doing mottling and you're doing, a Focke-Wulf or an ME109, that start-stop that you have to do when you're doing, mottling even adds more to the tip dry. So if I'm doing a mottling job, what I'll do is I might shoot 1, maybe 2 models, and then I'll pull back, I'll clean the tip, I'll test it on a piece of paper, and then I'll shoot 1 or 2 models, and then I'll clean the tip. And some people think, my God, that's so laborious. And it is. It really is. But that is the one way of stopping that giant paint goober from flinging itself into the middle of that panel when you're doing your mottling job, is to simply, wipe the tip more often. I don't see another way around doing that.
So for those start-stop kind of applications, either modeling or fine lines, I've experienced what you're talking about, and, sanding that goober out takes more time than cleaning your airbrush tip, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. And not to mention the fact that sometimes, and it doesn't happen often because I like to think that almost everything is fixable, but sometimes, and as chance will often have it, that goober will land right in the middle of this perfect pre-modeled scheme that you were just tightening up. And now to go back and fix it, you're going to lose a lot of that work. So yeah, I think it's time well invested in just wiping that tip off every couple of minutes when you're shooting an acrylic paint. And lastly, something to think about shooting acrylics is oftentimes the mess that they make in your brush compared to an enamel or even a lacquer. If mishandled, acrylics can turn into an evil goo that you're just going to have to end up chiseling out of your brush. And so there's a couple of things there with regards to shooting acrylics that your folks may want to think about. One of which is, prior to adding any paint to that paint cup, run a little thinner through your paintbrush, preferably thinner that has some Liquitex in it. So if you're shooting Vallejo, your Life Color Model Master, whatever you're doing, Tamiya with acrylic-based thinner, not the lacquer-based thinner. The Liquitex does not like lacquer-based thinners. It prefers acrylic-based thinners. So if you have some of your thinner with Liquitex, your pre-made solution made up, put some of that in your paint cup 2-3 minutes before you begin to shoot paint. That allows all of the inner surfaces of your brush to be wet, preferably wet with thinner and Liquitex, prior to the introduction of paint. And the idea there is that paint is going to stick less avidly to wet metal than it will to dry metal. So if you want to, hedge your bet when it comes to clean the brush that you're not going to have a big job, wet the brush before you put acrylic paint in it, and then blow that thinner Liquitex out. Then add your diluted acrylic paint. While you're shooting, the second tip, first tip is add thinner before you add paint. Then while you're shooting, the second tip is don't ever let the brush run dry. A lot of guys will, forget themselves and run the brush dry and have to add more paint to finish the job. In addition to that, and I did this for years, many guys after the end of their airbrushing job, they've got half a cup of paint in their airbrush, and they'll point it at the garbage can or the cat, and they'll let that go until they hear the sound of the hiss of air going through their brush, thinking that they're just going to dump their paint out before they begin the cleaning process. That hiss of paint is the sound of that sound, that hiss of air, I should say, that hiss of air is the sound of paint drying to the innards of your airbrush. So if you don't ever let it run dry, again, you are hedging your bet that when it's time to clean the brush, you're going to have an easier job. And lastly, shooting acrylics, you guys are probably going to want to think about something that I've been teaching in my airbrushing classes for a while, and it works for most guys who tried it, and that's 3 for 5. And that's 3 soaks for 5 minutes. So you're done shooting paint. Don't dump that paint out. Don't shoot the paint out. Take a Q-tip, wick as much of the paint out of the paint cup as you can. Add thinner to the cup, another Q-tip. Clean as much of that paint out of the paint cup as you can. Then add thinner to your paint cup. Work the lever so you can get thinner running down, the brush. Make sure you got thinner coming out the needle when you work the lever rapidly back and forth. Blow a little thinner through the brush. And then if you have a shot glass, and I'm guessing you guys do have a shot glass.
Oh, we might.
Yeah. Take a shot glass and take some of your thinner. You only need about maybe a quarter of an inch or a half an inch. Put that in the bottom of a shot glass. Disconnect your airbrush from the air and put it nose down into your shot glass with your acrylic water-based cleaner or your thinner, whatever you're using. And let that sit like that for 5 minutes. So here you've got the air cap completely submerged in the thinner. So that's going to go through the air cap and surround the nozzle and the needle. You've got thinner inside the brush from the paint cup through the tunnel through which the needle protrudes. After 5 minutes, blow that dirty thinner out, put a fresh cup of thinner in there, work the lever so it wicks down out of the needle, put it back in your shot glass, go away and do a decal for 5 minutes. When that second 5 minutes is done, blow it out, replace it with the third, go do another decal. So if you do 3 5-minute soaks, and it really is the time that the brush is sitting with all of this thinner surrounding all of those dirty parts, it takes time for that paint that has adhered to the metal to go back into solution. You can do a better job cleaning your brush with 3 5-minute soaks than running a gallon of thinner through it in 3 minutes. It's the time that is required to get the paint back into solution.
That's interesting. I had not thought of that, because my tendency is to blow through a bunch of thinner for a minute or two. And I hadn't thought about the paint returning to solution.
Yeah, it takes time, and you can convince yourself of that. You blow a minute of thinner through there, right? And then put some fresh thinner in your paint cup, put some nice clean thinner in your shot glass, okay? And then put your nose of the airbrush in the shot glass, go away for a couple of minutes. When you come back to the shot glass, before you pull the brush out with the tip submerged underneath the thinner or your cleaner, move the lever real quick. You're going to be surprised how much paint gushes out of that nozzle, even after you blew a whole minute of thinner through it. If you let it sit for 5 minutes, you're going to be surprised at the amount of paint that comes out.
It makes sense. I had not thought of that at all, but that makes sense that it requires time for the thinner to act on the paint to return it to solution.
Exactly. And, just as an aside, not to get all geeked out here, it was probably 20 years ago when I came home from lab where, as a biochemist, I would set things up and, biological chemistry, you do a lot of incubations, and you go away for 10 or 15 minutes, you come back, you add a magic elixir, you go away for 10 minutes. And it struck me, I have not tried this approach with, cleaning my airbrush, just giving it time to soak. And I've been doing this trick now for, many, many, many years. Guys who've switched over to it swear it gets their brush cleaner. And the bottom line is, the fewer times you have to break your brush down, the better. And a lot of guys break their brush down every time they clean or every time they shoot. Some guys break it down even between each color. But if you get into a habit of wetting the brush before you add paint, not ever letting the brush run dry, either while you're painting or before you clean it, and then doing 3 soaks for 5 minutes each, I don't have to break my brush down. I break it down about every 3 models. That's not an exaggeration. Now, if it, and it occasionally gets gummed up, you'll get a goober. You can't stop that from happening. But barring any problems with paint or, any goober formation because I got a bad batch of, whatever, if I'm just doing normal spraying and I do these simple tricks of keeping the brush wet and the 3 for 5 soaks, I can go through 2 models worth of airbrushing and not have to break my brush down.
One thing that I've seen you advocate that I'll be honest with you, I'm just now understanding, and keep in mind, I've been airbrushing for 30 years, is the very close when you're doing very fine work, very close distance to the subject. Yeah. And almost touching the actual surface of what you're painting.
Yeah. So if you go on the site, you've probably seen it. I took the Zvezda 1/144th scale I-16 Rada, one of my all-time favorite airplanes, just a neat-looking airplane.
Yep.
And to demonstrate what an Infinity can do, I should say, full disclosure, I'm a Harder Steenbeck guy. I've got an example of every airbrush ever made in my collection. And after, 37 years or whatever it turns into of airbrushing and trying every make and brand, Harder Steenbeck is my brush. There just isn't a brush that outperforms it. So I wanted to try to demonstrate what that brush can do with the 0.15 tip and properly diluted paint. So I shot this 1/144 scale I-16, which, can fit into the palm of your hand and still have room to taxi. And I did it, with the 0.15 tip, super diluted paint, and the working distance. And I also should stop and say I did a Spanish Civil War scheme that was modeled. And the working distance when I was doing the modeling on that I-16 was somewhere around 4 millimeter.
That's close.
It's close. It's really close. But then again, if you're going to shoot a line that is a 0.5 millimeter wide, not a millimeter wide, but a 0.5 millimeter wide, which is my definition for super fine line. Fine line I put at 1 millimeter wide. And that's good for most guys doing most of the work that we like to do. Some of us, like to build 1/44 scale or do figures that require super fine line, which I would put at 0.5, 0.5 millimeter wide. If you're going to go down to 0.5 millimeter wide lines, you're going to be shooting paint. Now I'm painting with a big brush here. Okay. You're going to be shooting paint that's somewhere around 25% paint, 75% thinner. So you're going to have super dilute paint. You're going to compensate for that diluted paint by shooting at a pressure of somewhere between 6 to 8 psi. Most guys shoot at 10 to 12. For super fine line, you're going to be somewhere around 6 to 8 psi. And then your working distance, as I said, will be about 3 millimeters. And it's the working distance that guys have the hardest time getting used to. Yeah. Intuitively, we don't want to get that close to the model. We think the paint's going to run, it's going to spider. We're going to run the needle into the surface of the model. So intuitively, you don't want to get that close to the model. But if you're going to do super fine line, that's what you kind of have to do.
That brings up another subject. I have seen some airbrushers advocate removing the protective air tip and spraying. Especially when they're doing fine work, they spray with the protective cap off.
Yeah, I do that as well. I like doing it that way because I can monitor buildup. I can monitor my tip dry, if you will. And without the protector on, even the Harder Steenbeck protector, which gives you pretty good view of the needle, I even take that off when I'm doing fine line, so I can look for that buildup. Because again, as soon as that begins to build up, especially if you're shooting fine line or super fine line, any buildup on the needle will affect performance at that point. I liken super fine line airbrushing and fine line airbrushing to some degree to playing dominoes or a line of dominoes that all have to fall exactly the same way in order to get it to work. Super fine line is like that. Everything has to fall the right way. So yeah, that being the case, I'll take the tip off so I can watch the needle. I don't recommend new guys doing that because it makes it really easy to run that needle into things. But after a little bit of time, just practice with the brush, it becomes more intuitive.
Aren't you the guy who said that as far as bending the tip of your needle, it's a matter of if, not when?
It is if not when, because everybody does it. And while we're on that, just real quick, if it does happen to you, and it will, the thing to do is let out the obligatory profanity. And after you do that, before you pull the needle out of the nozzle, take a moment to put that under some good light with good magnification and see how bad the needle's bent. Because it can be bent so bad that if you pull the needle out, you will rip the nozzle.
Gotcha.
And if that's the case, now you have to replace both. So take a moment and look at that needle. And if it is bent that bad, you can grab a stiff pair of tweezers and simply bend it straight, pull it out that way, thereby saving your nozzle. The other thing is, just to go back real quick to fine line airbrushing. One more trick that I discuss in a couple of articles that a lot of guys find kind of a novel approach because they hadn't thought of it, is the whole idea of immobilizing the model that you're painting, and as well as immobilizing your hand. Especially if you're doing this 1/1/4 scale rata with a modeled camouflage. That was either way of just demonstrating the brush or a very pathetic cry for help.
Or both.
Maybe a little bit of both. But in order to shoot anything that small, the model is immobilized, and I like a pan of ice and just a wad of clay. And the pan of ice gives me a swivel head, so I can put the model on a pan of ice and have it so that it is exactly at the angle I need for each shot that I'm making. And then I have a wrist brace in front of that my wrist fits in, that holds my hands steady. And then when I'm doing that fine line work, all I'm moving is my wrist. I'm not moving my arm. I'm not moving anything other than just my wrist. I love guys who come to the shop for fine line, instruction. And I ask them, first show me how you do your fine line. And they pick their Spitfire up in their left hand and they pick their airbrush up in their right hand. And both hands have a certain oscillation to them. And I think where it's going to go from there. The whole idea is immobilize the model, immobilize your hand. And that's really half the ballgame.
If you don't mind, I'd like to roll this back just a bit and get a little more detail on this Liquitex product.
Sure.
Liquitex, when you first said that, my only experience with Liquitex is like tube acrylic paints for an artist.
Yeah, that's what they make.
So is that product really for that application?
So Liquitex Flow Aid is simply a flow enhancer made for any acrylic or water-based paints. So you can use it with anything. The Liquitex Flow Aid that I'm referring to, Joann's and Michael's, that is specifically for acrylic paints. Okay. And you can add it directly to the paint. You can add it if you're an oil painter and you're doing, actual, the tube paints. Or you can use it as an additive in the thinner, which is what I do. So anyway, and I'm glad you brought this up because there's one more additive that some guys want to think about, and that's also a drying retarder. If I am shooting in the summer and it's a hot, arid day with not a lot of humidity and an abnormally high temperature, that is the worst condition or conditions for acrylic paint. High temp, low humidity. So you're going to have the paint cooking off and drying even faster than normal. In a situation like that, I will go, let's say I'm shooting Vallejo. Let's say I'm shooting Vallejo color, not Vallejo, model air, but Vallejo color. So if I'm shooting that, I will go to my thinner and I will add my Liquitex Flow Aid. That's going to help the tip dry, stop the goober buildup. But on a real hot, arid day, you actually have to slow the paint down a little bit as well. Slow it down with regards to how fast it dries. So I'll also add I prefer Tamiya paint retarder, but you can also use Liquitex paint drying retarder. Okay, either one works. and give you a percent volume. You can use both up to about 10% by volume in any of your acrylic thinners: Model Master, Life Color, Tamiya acrylic, Vallejo, Mission. All of those acrylic paints benefit from both Liquitex Flow Aid, 5 to 10%, and a drying retarder, Tamiya or Liquitex drying retarder at 5 or 10%. Lastly, and not to get too tangentized, but I sometimes get a little frustrated when I go on, I force myself to go on Facebook and some of these other kinds of forums, and I read these guys having these hellacious arguments about their airbrushing rigs. And then you dig a little deeper into this argument, and you read that one guy is sitting on the coast of England and the other guy is in Mesa, Arizona. And you're looking, and the guy in England is saying, "Oh, your tip dry is being caused by X, Y, and Z," and the guy in Arizona is saying, "Well, nothing you're saying works for me." And it's like, well, this is never going. I mean, this is apples and oranges, right? The differences in humidity, the differences in temperature alone are going to make those two areas require entirely different approaches to make the paint work, right? So something to keep in mind if you go on a forum and you read, "Oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that," take a moment and see if this person is in Bolivia or are they in Florida, right? First thing. Second to that, and then I don't want to, again, get too tangentized, but I was invited out to Kolpar's Hobby in Denver to give an airbrushing class. And I'm going to say hi to a couple of guys there, John Taylor being one of them, invited me out there.
It's a great hobby shop. I was out there for business, and I made a point of walking 5 miles to get there, and it was well worth the experience.
Exactly. I grew up looking at the Kolpar's ads in the back of Fine Scale Modeler. Remember those?
Yep.
And I could not wait to go to Kolpar. So I jumped at the opportunity, and the guy was absolutely a gentleman, great to work with. But here's the point to the whole long story is I went out there with my brush, my thinners, and my paint. It was my rig, okay? I sat down in that hobby shop, and I dialed in my favorite mix for a fine line, and it didn't work. It didn't work at all. Prompting John Taylor to stand up and go, "I knew it." So what happened was, first and foremost, when I looked down at the compressor, I'm reading 25, 30 pounds on the compressor to give me the same airflow that I get at sea level Seattle at 12 to 15. So that was the first indication that things are different at altitude. And that was the problem. I was in the Mile High City. It was a bit of a warm day. It was a warm, arid day. And with that much less partial pressure, versus being in sea level Seattle, the paint behaved entirely differently. And I managed to dial in a fine line, 0.5 millimeter, very nice. I was pleased with it. But the elixir I ended up having to use and the pressures I had to use were worlds different than what I would have used if I were in sea level Seattle. So I always think of this when I go into those forums and I see the arguments, and I just kind of shake my head, because you have to wonder how many of these guys are arguing about apples and oranges.
I hadn't thought of that at all, but yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let me ask you a question. What do you do with your hose, the hose that runs off the airbrush down to your compressor?
I'm glad you asked about hoses, David. Because I went online a couple of weeks ago. I had a customer buy a brush from me, and he bought the real purdy Harder Steenbeck blue silk wound airbrush hose, which is not it's not ridiculously expensive, but it ain't cheap either.
Right.
And I actually talked him into the cheaper plastic hose. And he was surprised that as a dealer, I was trying to talk him into the cheaper hose. But I firmly believe that clear plastic hose is a better hose to use. And he cued me in on a couple of guys online. I'm not going to mention any names. All I'll say is their company rhymes with Rex and only has a blue or a green cloth hose. But they expound upon how, their words, stupid it is to waste time with a hose that's plastic if you're serious about airbrushing. I couldn't disagree anymore. First and foremost, the clear hose allows you to see condensation building up in the hose before it gets to your brush. And for some guys, that can mean the difference between saving their paint job and not. Because we all know what happens when you get that bolus of water that comes through your brush and goes right through your brush and onto your model. So if you're in a situation where you're dealing with water in the line, a clear plastic line will allow you to see that buildup and do something about it before it ruins your finish. Number two, the clear hose that I prefer, it's the Harder Steenbeck version, comes with a special fitting on one end that allows you to disassemble the hose and cut it to the ideal length. And I can't emphasize how handy that is. Not only does it get all the coil of hose out from around your ankle or your bench, depending on your rig, but also the shorter the hose, the better, because it gives you less surface area for condensation to form. It does. And lastly, although it's not as big of a consideration, but it is a consideration, if you're, running 8 feet of hose, you're going to have a certain pressure drop across that hose, from the compressor to your brush, versus if you're running 4 feet of hose. My compressor is right in my shop. My compressor and my booth are 90 degrees to my workbench. And my hose is only, not to get too personal, but my hose is about 3.5 to 4 feet long. And that's ideal. And I think that's pretty much good for most benches, is about 4 feet.
Looking at the article you sent us, you've got the rough and pebbly finishes on there. That's always a fun one.
I do. And that rough and pebbly finish goes right back to that too thick a paint. I love to tell guys, if you want to convince yourself that, shooting a thinner dilution of paint is worth the time and bother, shoot your 50% dilution on a sheet of plastic. And then with that same paint, dilute it from 50% down to 30%, maybe 40%. And shoot it right next to, on the same sheet of plastic, right next to your 50% solution. And then wait for that to dry and head outside when you got a nice, sunny day, and, shine a ray of light off those two different finishes and see which one is finer, is smoother. And of course, it's going to be the lower dilution of paint. So yeah, that's another really good reason to think about, getting that paint dilution lower. Is gone are the rough pebbly finishes that are so, characteristic of high dilutions or high paint, concentrations.
Well, and that's especially true like on wing roots, where you have airflow when you're airbrushing, and airflow runs. And lots of modelers tend to have a problem where they end up with dry, pebbly finishes up in the wing roots.
Yeah.
Where the air has flowed and dried the paint as it's flowed, if it's a thicker paint.
Yeah. So anywhere where you have a 90-degree shot, right? So fuselage, wing root, vertical stabilizer, horizontal stabilizer, right? Any of those areas. Liquitex will do a surprisingly good job of lessening that powdery, pebbly overshoot on those 90-degree areas. So that's the first thing I say there is a little Liquitex will go a long way to help that. The other thing is, again, backing up a little bit, is shooting dry coats versus wet coats. And I don't know if you guys are familiar. I mean, it's a pretty basic, concept in airbrushing, where you're going to be shooting a dry versus a wet coat. And here, a dry coat is such that the flow is adjusted and the brush is held probably farther back from the model, so that the paint basically becomes tacky as it flies through the air before it hits the model. And if you maintain a consistent dry coat, that area where the paint is hitting the model will not have any shine to it, because the paint will have lost most of its water and it will be flat. The moment you step into a wet coat, you'll see that area where the paint hits the model turn shiny. That is a wet coat. The only reason I bring this up is one trick to getting around those 90-degree shots like wing roots and such is, in addition to adding a little Liquitex, is a technique where you go in and you lay a dry coat down. Let's say on the side of the fuselage, you lay a dry coat down, and then you lay another dry coat down on the base of the wing, 90 degrees to the fuselage. And then, since you have this nice tacky dry coat in place, you can go back with a pretty rapid wet coat, maybe 1 or 2 passes, that will hit the model and stick and not run or spider on you, because you're shooting that wet coat on top of that dry coat, which is going to serve to hold that wet paint in place and kind of help it stick and not spider on you. So in addition to the Liquitex, if you shoot a dry coat followed by a fast wet coat on those 90-degree areas, that's another easy trick for decreasing that pebbly overspray.
That's a great tip.
Did that make sense?
Yes, that's a great tip.
So what else, guys? Oh, you want to talk about matching the dilution and the needle and nozzle size to the job?
Absolutely. I don't think that most people even think about the needle and nozzle size. I have an airbrush. It has a needle. It has a nozzle. I'm going to spray with it.
So another issue a reason that you're going to get a pebbly finish is if you are using a nozzle that is too small. So you're as the paint goes through the nozzle and the needle, it becomes atomized, right? It becomes a fine spray, and every nozzle size has an ideal window, where it will give you the best atomization of that paint, right? I'm going to, again, broad strokes here, but most nozzles in my hand give the optimal atomization at about 40 to 50% throw of the lever. Okay?
Gotcha.
Once you go past 40 or 50% throw, you're going to start seeing stipple on the outside of your pattern. And that stipple is paint that is not sufficiently atomized. It's in little droplets. Okay? Those little droplets, the insufficiently atomized paint, is what is going to cause that rough, pebbly finish. So one way to ensure that you don't get that is to match the tip size. The tip being the needle nozzle combination is the tip. Match the tip size to the job. So you're shooting primers and you're shooting a 48 scale airplane. You're shooting a Mustang and you're going to shoot primer. For a model that size, I would shoot all my primers with a 0.4 or 0.3 to 0.4 millimeter tip. That's going to give you good coverage because it's a pretty good size model, and it'll give you the finest finish. Now, let's say you've primed that in white, and let's say it's a Mustang that's not natural metal but OD green, and you're going to want to do some pre-shading on the panel lines. Well, you're not going to use a 0.4 tip. You could try, but you're not going to get a very fine line with a 0.4 tip. So for the pre-shading, I'll jump down to a 0.15 tip, or I would say a 0.2 millimeter tip or smaller. I use 0.15 because that's the smallest tip in the Harder Steenbeck range. If you have an Iwata micron, it would be a 0.18 tip. Most airbrushes have a small tip in the range of a 0.2 to a 0.25. So for pre-shading, I'm going to drop down to that smaller tip because, again, for that thin line, that smaller tip is going to give me the kind of atomization and control I need to get that fine line. Now I've done my pre-shading and I'm into painting color. And let's say, just for argument's sake, this is a Mustang that had 2 colors on it. Let's say green and tan, okay, it's Australian. You look at the surface area of that wing, and let's say you divide the wing in half. One half's tan, the other half's green. So for the color part, since it's not going to be one color, but 2 colors, I'd use about a 0.2 or a 0.3 tip to put the color on. Because there, if I used a 0.15, I would be driving the 0.15 tip too far beyond its optimal point to get good atomization. If I used a 0.4, it would be too big a tip for the appropriate atomization. And then finally, to end with, let's say you've done your decaling and you're ready to shoot that final clear coat to tie it all together. I would jump back to that 0.4 size tip again to get the finest finish and to match the size job to the size tip that you're shooting. So again, there's an article on my site literally called Matching the Dilution and the Tip Size to the Job, where I give examples, pictures of the models and the exact tip sizes I use to paint each portion of the paint job. Yeah. And lastly on that, in addition to matching the tip size needle nozzle combo, the thing you're going to want to also match to that is the paint dilution. And this is where guys sometimes run into an issue, because a lot of guys want to use one dilution of paint. They've made good with 50% paint, and they're having a hard time dialing in a fine line, and they don't understand why, because 50% paint has always worked good for them. 50% paint's pretty thick to dial in for a fine line. So again, if you're doing a fine line, you're going to want to be dialing down to somewhere between 20 to maybe, 15 to 25% paint for a real fine line. You're going to be using a fine size tip, 0.15 or 0.18. Then if you're doing general work, you're doing wheel wells, cockpits, you're an armor guy, you're doing, the inside of a tank, you're doing, general size work. At that point, you go from 20 to 25% paint to 30 or 40% paint. You go from a 0.15 tip to a 0.2 or a 0.3 size tip. And then lastly, you're doing your primers and clear coats. I won't touch dilution on there because, primers and clear coats, there's so many different ones out there, and there's so many different dilutions out there. But one thing that is universal is if you're going to be shooting a primer and a clear coat, and the surface area that you're going to be covering is become that large, you're going to switch to, again, a 0.35 or bigger tip for the primer or the clear coat. So again, this is all in that article, matching the paint dilution, tip size to the job. And we didn't even touch on air pressure, but we talked about that earlier. Was that too verbose?
No, that was perfect. So the general rule is the smaller the needle tip size, the more diluted the paint.
Exactly. In general, the finer the line, the smaller the tip, the more dilute your paint's going to be. Exactly right.
And the lower the air pressure.
So you can think of it as this tip size and, leave it at that. I actually put this together in a chart that's in the article, and I tried to make it pretty easy so guys could go to the chart and say, okay, I'm doing general work. I'm doing wheel wells, so that's going to be 30% paint, 0.2 tip, 12 to 15 PSI. Oh, I'm doing fine line. Okay, that's going to be 15 to 25% paint. That's going to be a 0.15 tip, or the smallest tip I have. And that's going to be somewhere around 10 to 12 PSI. And then primers and clear coats. Again, dilution, so variable, but you're going to be using a larger tip, 0.35, 0.4. And for primers and clear coats, I push my pressure up to around 12 to 18 because the tip is a little larger and you need a little bit more pressure to drive that tip and get good atomization. So I put my pressure up a little bit higher. And then lastly, when it comes to air pressure on fine line, most guys realize that the average airbrushing compressor will give you a low value of about 10 psi, and they won't really give you anything below 10 psi, and you shouldn't trust it anyway. The easiest way to dial in a fine line for those super fine line that requires a very low air pressure is to have an inline air valve, on your airbrush. Grex makes one, Harder Steenbeck makes one. I think a couple other companies do as well. And for a fine line, again, I'll have my 0.15 tip. I'll have my 20 to 25% paint made up. I'll have my Liquitex and my paint retarder in there, right, for doing fine line. I'll dial in about 10 or 12 PSI on my compressor. But then using the inline air valve, I will dial that 10 or 12 down to about 6 or 8. And that 6 or 8 is a guesstimate, but it's somewhere in that range of 6 to 8. There's really no other way to dial your air pressure down sufficiently low using the airbrush compressor, air regulator. It's just not fine enough.
We've talked about acrylics. Is there any you favor over the others? And if so, why?
There are. And each acrylic has its strengths, has its weaknesses.
Maybe that's a better discussion then, instead of trying to single one out.
Yeah. So I would suggest that. Yeah. So I think Vallejo is a perfectly fine paint. A lot of guys have luck with it. I shot it for years. I think the Vallejo Air does require further dilution if you want to get a real fine finish with it. I think it's a little thick coming out of the bottle. The Vallejo color definitely needs dilution prior to shooting. To me, in my hand, the finest finish that you can obtain with an acrylic is with life color. And life color has its own set of idiosyncrasies. A lot of guys have problems, unfortunately, with life color actually drying in the bottle. I think that isn't a problem as much as it was a few years back, so they've done something to address that. It also suffers from very bad tip dry. So you should probably think about adding some Liquitex and some Tamiya paint drying, retarder, if you're going to be shooting life color, because tip dry is very, very bad with it. In addition to that, the finish, once life color dries, it has a bit of a fragile finish. And I address that by actually adding future floor wax to my life color thinner. And just real quick, my life color thinner would be 5% Liquitex Flow Aid, 5% Tamiya paint dry retarder, and about 10% Pledge with Future Shine or Future. And then the balance of that would be just thinner. That's my base thinner for life color. And then I dilute life color to about 30 to 40% paint in that base thinner. That elixir, a little bit of Future Floor Wax in life color, will give you an absolutely beautiful, very, very fine, smooth finish. I go to life color when the finish really has to be velvety smooth and it's got to count. I usually shoot life color. Mission models, I'm a big fan of Mission models. When the paint first came out, I jumped on board early on. The paint, when it first came out, had a viscosity that was way, way higher than practically any other acrylic I'd ever seen. This stuff was almost like toothpaste. And anybody who shot it when it first came out will tell you, you didn't want to put it in your brush when you saw it goop out of the bottle, because it looked like it was going to be a bad deal. But when properly diluted, that paint is the most forgiving. When I used to demonstrate it at airbrushing clinics, I had to work to make it spider. I had to work to make it run. You can do that pretty easy with most other paints, which is why I got behind it as strongly as I did when the paint first came out. That said, I'm getting emails from guys who've gone to my site and they have looked at the dilution suggestions I've made for Mission, and they run into some issues because the Mission has changed in its viscosity from the first version that came out. And the paint is thinner now than it was originally. And it dilutes differently. So I actually have not worked up the new paint yet. I'm going to be doing that in the next week or two here. I'm going to be releasing an article that will be a follow-up article to my other ones on using Mission paint, and I'm going to address how to dilute this newer, thinner formula.
Do you know why it's suddenly different?
That's a good question. I don't know why it's different. I can only tell you that the formula changed, and it is clear when you shake the bottle that the paint isn't as thick as it was, and it shoots fine. I've been shooting it, and again, I'm not complaining about the paint, but the paint is going to behave differently now than it did when it was first released, and check the site in the next week or two for an article that will be addressing that. So that's for Mission. Model Master, I shot Model Master acrylic for years with really good results. And for Model Master, again, you can use the same numbers as Vallejo, roughly. I'll take Model Master thinner. I'll add Liquitex to about 10%. Tamiya paint retarder, about 5 or 10%. For Model Master, 20%. 20 to 30% for fine line is good. 30 to 40% paint for general is good. The one issue about Model Master that you have to be mindful of is that once it dries, if if you've used it, once it dries, especially if it dries in your brush, it can be really difficult to get out.
Like concrete.
Yeah, it's one of those acrylics that really likes to stick. That being the case, it was one of the first articles I released on Model Paint Solutions that looked at the efficacy of some of these airbrush cleaners that various companies sell. And if you go look at that article, I think it's Tips and Tricks Volume 4. I set up a little scientific assay to look at how various paints reacted to cleaners. And most acrylic paints turn into an evil goo when you expose them to lacquer thinner. Not surprisingly, because you're pulling the water out of the paint and the paint turns into, a dehydrated, evil mess. Model Master acrylics is the one exception there. Model Master acrylics dissolve very quickly in lacquer thinner. And again, it is the one exception, because if you try that with most other acrylics, they will turn into a goo that will haunt you the rest of your life. But if you do have Model Master gooed up in your brush, try a little lacquer thinner. You'll be surprised.
I would not have thought that.
Yeah, I didn't either. And I ran the assay myself and I couldn't believe the results. And there you have it. I have heard from multiple customers that have tried it, to get dried Model Master out of the brushes, and it worked perfectly fine. So that's that for Model Master. I'm just now getting into the AK Interactives. I've been shooting the extreme metals for a couple of years, and I absolutely love the AK Extreme Metal range. I used them first on a Focke-Wulf 190 V18 Kangaroo. That's a 2-part article on the site, and was really impressed with them. And I would say if you're still shooting lacquers and you have the booth and the hardware required to shoot lacquers and you want to do metallics, I would think about the AK Extreme Interactive metallics. They are excellent. And I'm just now getting into the AK Real Colors, and I've shot them a couple of times, and I'm very impressed with them as well. We got a lot of good paints to choose from right now, almost too many.
We joke about that quite often.
Yeah. Yeah, and we haven't even gotten to some of the smaller brands that are coming out, that have come out really in the last couple of years. We're only touching on the big ones. Tamiya is one that I want to touch on real quick, only because so many guys use it. And, it's the one acrylic paint, I call it the AC/DC of acrylic paints. AC/DC in that you can bring it up in a water-based acrylic thinner, like their, I think it's their X20, which is their, acrylic-based thinner. You can also bring Tamiya up in a lacquer-based thinner. And when I shoot Tamiya, I actually prefer to dilute it in Gunze leveling thinner, which is a lacquer thinner. And Tamiya shoots beautifully if you dilute it in Gunze lacquer thinner.
Unicorn tier solves all problems.
It's true. It is very true. And, while we're on that, the Gunze leveling thinner, if you're shooting any of the AK Interactive metallics, a drop or two of Gunze leveling in your paint cup of AK Extreme Metallic will actually lay it down even a little nicer.
I'm going to have to get some.
You talking about the Extreme Metallics?
No, the leveling thinner.
Oh, yeah, that is good stuff. That is really good stuff. And when you see it, buy a lot of it, because it can be hard to find.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're up over an hour here. John, why don't you give us a direction to your website so folks can find all these great articles you got?
Well, I appreciate that. It's modelpaintsolutions.com. And once you hit the homepage there, you'll see Tips and Tricks Volume 1 through 4, which is a lot of the airbrushing articles. And if you hit any of those, most of the things that we discussed tonight are detailed in those articles. And then if you page down below the Tips and Tricks articles, you'll find, kit reviews and most of the other things that you find on the average modeling website.
Well, and one other thing, John, you also, I think you mentioned it tangentially earlier, you're a Harder and Steenbeck distributor. In fact, I got my Harder and Steenbeck Infinity, which I will tell you I have come to believe is the most amazing airbrush I've ever used. I happen to have gotten it from you, but the Harder and Steenbeck line is just really, really an impressive set of brushes.
I appreciate that. And if I could jump in for a second, when I started Model Paint Solutions, I don't come from a business background. As you know, I'm a research chemist. And so I'm not a business guy. And when I started Model Paint, I wanted to put stuff on the site that I can firmly stand behind. I don't want to find myself being forced into selling things that, quite honestly, I don't believe in. It may sound trite and it may sound, ooga booga, if you will, but it's sincere. And I had an opportunity to add many other brushes. Harder Steenbeck was, to be blunt, and the Harder Steenbeck folks are not going to like me saying this. It wasn't easy for me to actually get a dealership with them because I didn't have a storefront. I'm a website, and they were reluctant to actually sign me up. I had to show competency with the brush and competency with presenting the brush to the public. It was pretty surprising. But I went through that because, again, it's a brush I can stand behind. And lastly, I think of it as the 911, the Porsche 911 of airbrushes. When guys are ready to step up to a brush that will perform and give them the capability of doing a fine line, because it's simply a matter of physics. You're not going to get a fine line with a 0.25 tip or a 0.3 tip. You're going to have to get a smaller nozzle in order to get that fine line. The Harder Steenbeck gives you the ability to do that, and it gives you that at a price that is lower than what you'd have to pay if you were going to try to buy an Iwata Micron A, which is the comparable brush in the Iwata line. And I've got a Micron A. It's a beautiful brush. It's also a fair amount of money. And then lastly, the reason I love the Harder Steenbeck line is, in addition to just the sheer machining, the quality of the brush, I like to say once you put it in your hands, you're going to want to hold it again. It's true. The thing I like best about it is you've got multiple tip sizes to choose from. With one brush, you can go from a 0.15 to a 0.2 to a 0.4 in about a minute and a half. It doesn't take hardly any time to change the tips. And if you want to get the best finish and the most out of your brush, the idea of changing the tip to match the job is something that you're probably going to want to think about. And Harder Steenbeck comes right out of the box, ready to go with different size tip.
I call it the Ferrari of airbrushes.
Right. And you know what? Not everybody wants a Porsche 911. I get it. I got many customers that love building, I'm going to say it, love building armor. It doesn't mean that, I'm disparaging armor guys. I'm not. I build armor too. But, you're not doing that much fine line doing armor. And some of these guys are perfectly happy, shooting a 0.3, 0.4 tip. And that's all they need. More power to them. That's all you need. Not everybody needs to be driving a Porsche. But for the guys who want to get into the fine line stuff and they don't want to get frustrated, you might as well go ahead and go with the tool that's designed for it. And the Infinity is designed for fine line. That's the one thing it does.
Agreed.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate the compliment. Thank you, David.
Not a problem.
Thank you for joining us tonight for this session on airbrushing. We appreciate you coming on.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I hope I didn't talk too much.
No, this is perfect, and we'll have to have you back.
Please, let's pick a subject or a topic, and I will be here.
Sounds great.
All right.
Thank you, guys. Enjoy your evening.
So, Mike, we're coming to the end of the episode here. So, what's your shout out of the month?
Well, I'm going to shout out our latest contributors. Since last episode, we've gained a few new or continued support from some folks. Tim Cavalier, Eric Simmelmeyer, Michael Strucker, Mike Halliday, Michael Shelley, and Ray Borman. So, gentlemen, those named Mike, I appreciate that. And those not named Mike, same to you. We appreciate that equally. Thank you all so much. This is all most appreciated. It's really going to help us bring you more content and offset our hosting costs and all that. So if anybody else would like to support the show, you can do so at www.plasticmodelmojo.com. Please click the heart icon in the upper right corner of the homepage. That will take you to a PayPal link, and you can contribute whatever you like. We appreciate anything you're willing to share with us. These links are also at the top and bottom of the show notes of every episode. Well, not every episode. Any episode I actually publish show notes for. You can find that link in there as well. So thank you, gentlemen, who've contributed. Those who contributed more than once, I really appreciate that. And I'm sure you do too, Dave. So
Absolutely. It has been. It's been fantastic. I'd like to shout out a number of our listeners who are 72nd scale aircraft modelers have chosen to join the 72nd scale aircraft forum where I got moderation duties. It's a great forum for 72nd scale aircraft, anything aircraft related. There are a lot of great builds. There are a lot of great tips. Some really fantastic modelers hang out over there. I appreciate everybody who's a listener, who's a 72nd scale aircraft modeler, coming over and joining there. So I appreciate that, and shout out to all the new members.
Well, I've got another one.
All right.
Well, it's our friend Jeff Groves out of Yorktown, Indiana, and I mentioned him back a little earlier in the podcast with his blog, Inch High Guy. I want to give him a shout out for a little historical nugget he sends us based on something you mentioned in a recent episode. But before I get into that, first he says if TACOM releases an Iowa class 16-inch gun turret, he's doomed.
For those who don't know, Jeff was in the Navy and in charge of one of the turrets.
Well, he'll have to model a little inch high guy.
Exactly.
Well, he shares with us based on, you mentioned the USS Ward as a desired kit in 72nd scale.
Yeah.
When we were running down our desired kits for 2021. And he gives a little bit of history on the USS Ward, which is actually kind of interesting. So I thought I'd share this and give him a shout out for sending it to us. On the 7th of December, 1944, exactly 3 years after the Pearl Harbor raid, the Ward had landed 108 Army troops at Ormoc Bay in the Philippines when she was struck by a kamikaze. The Ward lost power and was unable to control her fires, and less than a half hour later, her captain ordered abandoned ship. The destroyer, USS O'Brien, DD-725, and other vessels took aboard the Ward's crew, and then the O'Brien sank the Ward with gunfire. In a strange twist of fate, the captain of the O'Brien that day was William W. Outerbridge, now a commander. He was the captain of the USS Ward during the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And commanded the destroyer, which sank her exactly 3 years later to the day.
That is one of those historical oddities that gives you chills. It reminds me the story of a last name McLean, whose house was in Manassas, Virginia, and served as the headquarters for the Confederate forces at the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Manassas. And then to get away from the war, he moves to Appomattox, Virginia. And 4 years later, the surrender of the Confederate forces takes place in his home in Appomattox. It's just one of those weird coincidences of history that, if somebody screenwrote it in Hollywood, you would be like, oh, that's too fantastic to believe.
Well, Jeff, thanks for that tidbit, and I hope we see you soon. I got some books to give back to you.
Yeah, hopefully he'll be in Indy, and hopefully we will too.
You got any more shout-outs?
No, Mike, I think that's it. I think the clock on the wall is telling us that this is a pretty full episode. So
I think so.
I think we've gotten to the end. You know what they say, Mike? So many kits.
So little time, Dave. Thanks again, buddy.
Take care,